My name is Kate Stewart, and I'm the president of the League of Women Voters of Greater Tucson. Thank you so much for joining us for this very important program titled Wasting Money, Wasting Lives, How We Fix Arizona's Criminal Justice System. We are a nonpartisan political organization encouraging informed and active participation in government. We've been around for over 100 years. We respectfully acknowledge that the League of Women Voters of Greater Tucson is on the land and territories of Indigenous peoples. Today, Arizona is home to 22 federally recognized tribes, with Tucson being home to the Tohono O'odham and the Pascua Yaqui people. The League of Women Voters is committed to diversity, equity, and inclusion and strives to build relationships with sovereign Native nations and Indigenous communities through educational programs, voter outreach, and advocacy. Before we start our program today, I have some announcements about upcoming programs next week. Tuesday evening at 6:30 p.m., we're going to have a very special event for the National Day of Racial Healing. We're very excited that we have invited some young people to hear their thoughts about that topic. On Wednesday night at 6 p.m., our state advocacy committees has a new criminal justice team, and they're going to meet to talk about our legislative priorities. And then next Saturday at 10 a.m., we're going to have a meeting with the Tucson NAACP chapter president, Dr. Cherie Meeks, about an effort to propose a new law in our state legislature to end cash bail. So please stay tuned until the end of this meeting to hear more from our president-elect, Nancy Hand, who's going to tell us more about those meetings. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to retired U.S. District Court Judge Charles Pyle, who's going to be our moderator today. We are very lucky to have him and all of our panelists to talk about this really important topic. So thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, Kate, and thank you to the League of Women Voters for all their effort in planning this event. I think all the people attending online and in Facebook will find this program very enlightening. 5 years ago, I listened to a presentation like this on mass incarceration at the YWCA. Part of the presentation was a panel discussion by 3 formerly incarcerated people. What has stayed with me ever since was that the woman on the panel referred to herself half a dozen times as, quote, the other, end quote. It appeared to me that she was referring to herself as the other more as a matter of self-perception than as trying to make a point. But it did make the point that among the many challenges like housing and jobs, one of the greatest challenges in transitioning from custody to community is stigma and lost self-esteem and the perception that the community is not ready to accept them. That people released from prison are nagged by the feeling of being the other is a logical outcome of the way the criminal justice system works. Repeated statutory changes making punishment more onerous, like mandatory minimums, 3 strikes, and truth in sentencing, were not based on policy analysis, but on the proven notion that fear of the other was a powerful political motivator in political campaigns. That these changes led to grossly disproportionate sentences and no incentive for good behavior in prison was of little consequence because it impacted people that were already socially ostracized. That 4 decades of this led to mass incarceration, satisfied the prevalent lock them up and throw away the key mentality. Prisoners were perceived essentially as discardable beyond redemption. So what are the characteristics of these people who end up in our prisons? 78%, according to the report from the state corrections, 78% in state prison in Arizona report a history of substance abuse problems at intake. In the December 2021 report, of the 33,855 prisoners, 795 are receiving addiction treatment. Nationwide, 55% of men and 75% of incarcerated women have a mental health condition. And a study in 2 of Illinois' men's prisons found nearly all prisoners have experienced a traumatic event. The prison experience itself is traumatizing and re-traumatizing for prisoners and correction officers. Prison admissions are driven by behavioral health problems and poverty, both of which are exacerbated by incarceration. And when I talk on this topic, I frequently discuss what I call the key criminal justice dichotomies. That is, one, when we deal with people in the criminal justice system, are we dealing with bad people or people who made a bad decision, committed a bad act? And the second dichotomy is for people on substance use with substance use problems, does that reflect a disease or a moral failing? 10 years ago, well, for most of the last 4 decades, most of the people in the criminal justice system would have readily gone with the notion that we're dealing with bad people who have a moral failing. And that was what was driving the policy that we were creating. But I think more recently, criminal justice administrators are understanding the science and understanding that what we're really dealing with is people who made bad decisions, frequently based on substance use problems and other circumstances that they've encountered in their life. But despite this new, more enlightened understanding, there is little in the way of policy change because the policies and procedures were established in the 4 decades of the bad people with moral failing understanding. I want to make a brief comment about the plight of corrections officers. We have a big problem with our corrections officers are overworked, very much overstressed. They work in a difficult environment, maybe some of it on their own making, but it is a terrible work environment. And for many years, we have had a gross understaffing, even as prison populations go up. So chronically, the Department of Corrections has 20% of the unfilled positions, while you see all those billboards in I-10 offering positions. At the SMU, it's 30% vacancy. This requires people to have forced to take double shifts in this already stressful environment, and it forces us to have programming people take security positions to fill the open spots. This is very unsafe for everybody at the institution. So as we talk about changes, when I talk about changes, one of the things I emphasize is that making an environment more humane should benefit everybody there, including the officers. I immediately suggest that we get the population from 34,000 down to 27,000. We should recognize that we cannot get the resources, the personnel resources, to house as many people as we're housing. The topic that bothers me the most is returning people to prison for technical violations. The CCJ study found that 9% of the people incarcerated at the Arizona State Prison were there on technical violations. Technical violations are not following the rules, but most of them, about a third of them, are directly related to a positive UA or a missed UA. And another third are due to what we call absconders. But the absconders are people who either had a positive drop or a missed drop, or otherwise knew they were on their way back to prison and then decided to give up and stop cooperating. Here in Arizona, we still admit over 200 people a month for technical violations, even during a pandemic. So my question to you is, if substance use disorder is a disease, is it moral to incarcerate people for a relapse? I started with a story, I'll end with a quick story. 6 years ago, I was invited to tour this very fancy new medical facility in California, state prison, the result of a class action lawsuit. When we were leaving, the warden asked me what I thought. And I said, you know, all the equipment and everything was really spectacular. Everything's good. What bothers me is the men have nothing to do. And I think that's a problem. But I said, what I was really impressed with in this $100 million facility was the signs to the clinics. The signs to the clinics were put perpendicular to the walkway so they'd be easily seen. They were pennant shaped and they were painted in different pastel colors. In other words, someone took $1,200 and made it look like we actually want you to come into our clinics. We want it to be easy for you. We recognize your humanity. That is the key issue here, is we need to understand the humanity of the people we're dealing with. And prison is a dehumanizing institution. We have to change that, and we have to, as a community, accept these people coming out of prison and get over the situation where these people are left with the burden of feeling like the other. I think that our difference in inaction has to change, and I think that the three speakers you're going to hear from will inspire you to want to make that change. Now, if you have any questions, I'm going to introduce the first speaker here in a second. If you have questions, please use the Q&A function on the chat, or a Q&A function on your, to ask, leave a question. The chat will not work. Our first speaker, Kate Vesely. I was cleaning my office 2 days ago, and I found a bunch of business cards, and I went through them, and half a dozen of them were from Kate Lawton, who apparently was having trouble holding a job. She kept moving from CPSA to the Pima County Attorney to Pima County government. But she's changed her name, and now she's landed at the head of the Pima County Justice Reform Unit. And I know that she has some exciting things planned for 2022 from that unit. So I'm really excited to hear from Kate, and I know you'll all learn a lot from it. So Kate, take it away.
Thank you so much, Your Honor. I feel very privileged to be invited here this morning, especially among this distinguished panel. But I also noticed in the participants list, it's many friends who have been doing this work alongside me in the trenches. I'm approaching 20 years in this field, what we would now call justice reform. I started doing this work in the early 2000s, working with individuals who had serious mental illnesses and were incarcerated. And it's now 20 years later, and I've never felt more motivated, inspired, or optimistic for the future of our community. Certainly, there's still a very long way to go, but we have much to be proud of here in our community here in Pima County. So as Judge Pyle said, my name is Kate Vesely. I am the director of Pima County's Justice Services Department. We are sort of a neutral intermediary providing services to the overall justice system. Our objectives are really just to make the system better, whether that be trying to save costs to taxpayers, trying to improve community safety, trying to increase resources, implement best practices, find grant funding, whatever our justice system partners need to be successful. That is our purpose in existing. So I get asked all the time, why does the justice system need reforming? There are still many individuals who say if something isn't broken, don't fix it. But I would argue most passionately that our system is broken and certainly was built off of a philosophy and an ideology that really isn't relevant in modern time, and certainly not with the justice involved population that we see nowadays. We have so much data now to be able to tell us how inefficient our justice system is working. If the objective of the justice system is to try and keep us safer, that is not what our system is resulting in. We found that just a correlation between high incarceration rates and a reduction of violent crime doesn't really exist. We are not safer by having more people in prison. We know from rising prison rates over several decades that our violent crime rates have not gone down, even though we've incarcerated more individuals than anywhere else in the world. We also don't have data that would support a philosophy that prison acts as a deterrent to crime. So much of our prison population is a result of substance use disorders, trauma, early childhood development, traumas in particular. And that is not something when somebody is acting off of trauma or substance use disorder, the rational act of, oh, I shouldn't do this because I might go to prison is not really part of our decision making. And we know that it's important to build a system around that component, that insight into how somebody who has substance use disorders and trauma makes decisions. We also don't have data that would support that the less someone, we do have data that would support that the less somebody is incarcerated, the more their outcomes improve. So we have years and years of research. So if we are able to keep somebody out of the justice system and overexpose them to the justice system, the better that they're going to perform. And that also includes directing them to treatment and mental health services and other pro-social events. So here's where we're at as a country. You can see our incarceration rates have gone up astronomically over many decades, and we spend just an absolute fortune across the country on prisons in particular. And that is actually only a small fraction of what the overall justice system costs when you factor in jail, criminal justice proceeding costs, court costs, attorneys. We are spending over an astronomical amount of funding. And about 1/5 of the incarcerated population nationally is serving time for a drug charge. And we know that serving time for a drug charge really has very little effect on deterring substance use disorder. In fact, most individuals who go into prison with some sort of substance use disorder will return to using substances within 2 years of their release. Arizona overall is not great, even compared to the rest of the country. We are the 5th highest imprisonment rate. In 2019, our incarcerated population was about 54,000 individuals between both jail and prison. And we even have more than that on probation, about 78,000 people on probation, another 7,000 on parole. And of that incarcerated population, 8,000 are in a private prison. We know that disproportionately, communities of color are incarcerated much higher than the rates of white individuals. So the rate of incarceration per 100,000 people, if you're white, it's about 400 and some, Hispanic about 700 some. For Black individuals, it's over 2,100 people per 100,000. So it's astronomically higher. And we spend about 1.1, I think that is a billion in Arizona on corrections costs. So the other thing that I get asked a lot is, well, what do you want? Do you want to have criminal justice reform, or do you want to have a safe community? And the reality is we really don't have to choose between the two of those. We know that when we incarcerate less and increase access to treatment and pro-social activities and employment and housing, that our community is much safer by improving those resources than trying to over-incarcerate those individuals. So what might criminal justice include? And it certainly is where we're working towards here in Pima County. We want to safely reduce those jail and prison populations. This is absolutely not just opening the door and letting everyone out. This is looking at who is really a risk to community safety versus who is in custody because they can't afford to pay their bond, or they're in custody because they have a long-term substance use disorder and it affects their ability to be able to show up for court or do certain things that they need to do to be successful on probation. So we're really trying to look at how do we identify individuals in our incarcerated population that is not a risk to community safety, but would benefit from other resources. It might include deflection and diversion opportunities so that we can reduce somebody's exposure to the more serious elements of the justice system. If we're able to identify young individuals who maybe this is their first or second time being connected with the justice system, if we're able to divert or deflect them and prevent them from going into jail or prison, we know that their long-term outcomes are exponentially better. Having treatment courts, problem-solving courts really helps those components too, because not only will they resolve their justice charges, but they're also going to have improved access to housing, treatment, job training, and what's really important as social connections, because so much of what we do in our decision-making, especially when we're young, is based around our peer group. We cannot do this work without addressing disparities and disproportionalities. We know that our system, like all systems across the country, is a reflection of the long-term inequities, racism, and bias that exist in our culture overall, and that is certainly overrepresented in our justice system. And finally, one of the best things that we can do is really change perceptions and reduce stigma about individuals who do have justice system involvement and what justice system reform includes. Another individual here on our panel, Manny, I'm so excited you guys get to talk to him. He has been a leader in our community for many, many years, really breaking through that stigma and helping people to understand how important having not only justice system history involved individuals with the work that we're doing, but also there at the decision-making tables. So our values in the community, certainly among our justice system partners here in Pima County, is really certain around using jail only for community safety, not the ability to pay a bond. And I'm really hoping, since you mentioned legislative changes, that's something that our legislator will look at in the next coming session. We want to have justice system programs that facilitate access to treatment, employment, pro-social supports while making those positive behavioral changes. We want to incorporate trauma-informed practices throughout the system, and we want to ensure that those individuals' lived experiences are at the table with all decision-making. These strategies make our system safer, and they save you, the taxpayer, a lot more funding. Pima County has been one of the very first MacArthur Safety and Justice Challenge sites. Since the program first launched in 2016, there was 10 sites, and I think we're up to about 50 or so across the country. The MacArthur Foundation, which you probably are familiar with because they sponsor things on NPR, they've got those genius grants. The Safety and Justice Challenge really focuses on safely reducing jail populations in particular and reducing racial and ethnic disparities in the justice system. We are currently in our third round of grant funding with MacArthur Foundation. We have an exciting project that's going to be announced next week as well that's going to specifically address those race and ethnic disparities in the justice system. And that news will be announced next week. Very exciting for our community. So here's some of the things that we have been working on as the justice system connected to our Safety and Justice Challenge. And we focus on court innovations in particular and treatment alternatives. Last year, Superior Court launched a new program called the STEPS Court, the Supportive Treatment and Engagement Program. That is a pre-indictment diversion program. But we also tried to incorporate a lot of behavioral health services and substance use screenings into screenings at the jail and also with our pretrial services. We've had a bunch of different strategies to reduce failures to appear. We implemented something called the Jail Population Review Committee, where a whole group of us every single week is going through the jail population, looking for individuals who do not present a risk to safety and would benefit from access to treatment. And then we do coordinated releases, get them into housing. It's a great program. And then finally, we've had a number of different strategies and much more to come to address those racial and ethnic disparities that I mentioned earlier. Since we started with the MacArthur Foundation in 2014, our average daily population over the course of the year was about 2,100. Every year that we've been involved in this program, it's trickled down a little bit. We saw a huge drop in 2020 thanks to COVID, and we're hoping to build on some of those early strategies during COVID and implement them long term. Our population did go up as things started to open up, but we've seen overall a much lower jail population, and I believe we have a lot more opportunity to grow there as well to reduce. So some of the main takeaways of justice system reform and what your Pima County community justice system partners have been focusing on. The justice system has a big responsibility. We have to make our community safe. We have to uphold our system of laws. We have to adhere to the tenets of justice and accountability. But not all consequences achieve those goals, especially when mental health and substance use disorders are involved. So we were trying to use data-driven decision-making, really good public policy that we can find based in those evidence-based practices to create new programs, create justice system goals, making our community overall more equitable, habilitative, because in many instances, individuals have not had that original habilitation, and certainly more cost effective. And when we identify those strategies to improve systems and increase access to resources and make sure that accountability is really accomplishing the tenets that we want them to see, recovery, we make Pima County a much safer and a better place for all of our citizens. So if anybody's interested in reaching out to us, certainly that's my email address right there. And also we have a listserv that you might be interested in participating in. If so, please send an email to justiceservices@pima.gov. We advertise all things happening in justice reform across our community. So if there is something like a training that you would like promoted or resources that you think our system partners would be good to be aware of, please send me an email and we'll make sure that we get it out to our community.
Thank you very much, Kate. The next speaker is Manny Mejias. I've known Manny for many years, and Kate has aptly described him as a reentry, as a leader in the Pima County's reentry initiatives. I know there a couple of years ago, Manny and I were spending too many midweek evenings at churches talking to people about reentry. So he's really gone over and above to get the message out. Manny was incarcerated in the Arizona State Prison from the age of 15 until the age of 35. I know he's about to deliver a very important statement of his experience. So Manny, let me turn it over to you and share your reflections.
Thank you very much, Your Honor. Hello, everybody. I've been asked to share my experience with you of what it's like to be incarcerated, so I thought the best thing to do was to tell you about my 18th birthday in prison. I'm an expert by experience, knowing the culture and living the culture for 20 years. So if you guys would indulge me, I'd just like to tell you this story. I'm 17 years old and 2 years into a life sentence. My cellmate and I are eating my last meal as a juvenile in the minors unit at the Arizona State Prison Complex in Tucson, Arizona. In a couple of hours at the stroke of midnight, I will be removed from my cell and escorted through the security doors that separate the boys from the men. I'm not sure what to expect, only now that I'm 18 and considered an adult. Now I have to learn how to swim in a sea full of sharks, being just a guppy. 11:50 p.m., we hear the CO coming down the hallway as his keys go into the door. I stand up and give my cellmate a half hug, tell him see you later, and I walk out. I'm removed from my cell and told to sit in the day room while we wait for the transfer orders to come across the radio. 11:58 p.m. The order comes over the radio, and I grab a laundry cart containing all my belongings and head for the Sally Port. The first door pops open, and I push my laundry cart into the Sally Port, and the door slams behind me. The only thing that remains between me and my fate is one more door. One more door is about to change my entire life. No happy birthday song, no congratulations, you're an adult, no fanfare whatsoever, just me and the unknown. This could be my last night on earth for all I know. The second door pops open. I take a deep breath and I push my life through the door. I'm scared to death, but I can't show it. Fear is a sign of weakness, and the last thing that I need to be seen is weak. It's May, but the night air is cool. It's not a cloud in the sky. I look up and I see the stars, and it's been years since I've seen the stars. The guards aren't saying a word. All I could hear are the wheels of the laundry cart rolling across the walkway. I think the guards are quiet because they don't know what's going to happen in either. My new cellmate could be somebody that's doing time for drugs, breaking and entering, or he could be a sexual predator. It's 1990s, and the Prison Rape Elimination Act wasn't created until 2003. So the guards are just trying to pretend that it's business as usual, which means my fate isn't any of their business until it becomes a problem for them. I get to the door of my new home. The guard unlocks the door, and I see a man spring up in his bunk with an angry look on his face. He probably didn't know he was going to get a cellmate in the middle of the night. He's tall and skinny, salt and pepper hair, probably in his 40s. It's about my height. And the first thing that I think of myself is, I think I can take him if I have to. I unload my property from the laundry cart and walk into the cell. The door closes and locks behind me, and the guard walks away. My new cellmate and I stare at each other for a few seconds, and then I tell him, my name's Manny. He says, they call me Floppo. You want a cigarette? I shake my head no, and he kind of smiles and laughs and says, don't worry, man, it's just a smoke. So I take the cigarette from him and I light it, never taking my eyes off of Floppo. He asks me, so what are you in for? And we spend the next few hours getting a feel for each other and our situation. You see, I could be some angry kid wanting to prove myself, wanting my reputation to precede me. So I could be using Floppo as an example to the other men of why I shouldn't be messed with. I have to get my own Floppo because he just gave me a cigarette, and I don't know if he's going to try to play a game with me or try to use me or try to rape me. It takes a few hours, but we're comfortable enough with each other to call it a night and get some sleep. Rocco just ended up being some guy who didn't want any trouble in his cell, and so was I. So the time we bunked together, we just made the best that we could, right? And that wasn't really the first traumatic experience I had while I was in prison, nor would it be my last. It was the everyday watch your back at all times trauma. We call that staying booted and suited. We call that always being ready so you won't get caught slipping trying to get ready. Then there are the exhausting mind games that the other prisoners and guards even try to play with you. You have to keep your wits about you so you don't end up owing somebody something. On top of that was the knowledge that not everybody in prison was completely sane. You really had to watch your back from those that were mentally incapable because they could just flip out for any reason. Then there's the depression, the loneliness, never ever really being able to get comfortable or relax. Add to that the stabbings, the killings, people who just dropped dead for heart attacks. It's a lot to absorb. A man named Lewis Reed submitted an article to the Huffington Post. The article was called Post-Traumatic Stress Disorder, PTSD Remixed. And in it, he said, when you live the experience, you can become the experience you live. I didn't know how true that was until I was released from prison. As the judge told you, I went to prison as a 15-year-old boy and I was released a 35-year-old man. My first 2 weeks home, I didn't sleep one bit. Every time the house would snap, crackle, and pop as it adjusted to the night air, would have me looking out windows with a flashlight, searching every room, seeing if anybody was trying to surround the house or break in. My family and friends tried to feed me all these foods that I hadn't tasted in years. And they wanted to feed me like a linebacker. But 20 years of prison experience taught me to eat small meals and eat fast. I couldn't eat the meals that they were giving me. I still have a hard time in crowds, especially if somebody bumps me from behind. In restaurants, I'm most comfortable if I could sit with my back against the wall. Until recently, I used to carry a knife with me everywhere I went in case I had to protect myself. I say until just recently because I actually found myself in a situation where I actually had to pull the knife. And 20 years of prison experience snapped me into survival mode. If my ex-wife hadn't dove in front of me, I'd probably be sitting in prison right now with another murder charge. The knowledge of what happened that night has me so scared that I won't carry a knife. I feel like I'm untrustworthy with any weapon, all because of 20 years of prison survival experience. I refuse to allow myself to be in any type of situation like that again. I hated every second of prison. I don't want to go back. I wouldn't wish it on an enemy. And because of that, I have to constantly manage my freedom. It's really not easy because more often than not, I have to be more civil than civilians. I'm a plague to most civilians. I'm a criminal that can't be trusted, a monster forever feared, without a second thought. It's a hard load to bear. I recently put a Facebook post up talking about PTSD and how the formerly incarcerated can have it too. Somebody that I knew from prison reached out to me and he says, you know, I still have prison nightmares at least twice a week. Another one that I know that was formerly incarcerated says, you know, I know that I need therapy, but nobody will take my insurance. That actually makes me wonder how many formerly incarcerated people are struggling with the aftermath of prison trauma. How many others have been released from prison only to be rearrested because something or someone triggered a PTSD episode and they didn't know how to handle it? How many other system-involved people struggle with depression because even though they want to be protected members of society, they can't? Because every time they place a check mark that says, have you ever been convicted of a crime? They're automatically dismissed as an untrustworthy criminal. How many formerly incarcerated people are out there self-medicating because they're not even aware of the trauma that they have? All they know is they don't fit in and there's nobody to talk to. Their family just doesn't understand. Society doesn't want to understand. I thank God for my ex-wife. I put her through so much stress and pain because I have a hard time living in a civilian world with a tainted prison mentality. I remember telling my stepdaughter, whatever you do, don't sneak up behind me, don't tickle me, don't jump on my back. You might scare me and you'll end up getting hurt. One day she opened the hallway bathroom door as I was passing by and all she saw was a black mass. She screamed and I spun around with a ready fist in full swing. By the grace of God, I was able to pull the punch before I knocked her out. All because of 20 years of prison survival training. She was crying, I was crying, we hugged and I told her, I said, baby, you shouldn't have snuck up behind me. She was crying and through sobs, all she said was, I didn't, I just opened the door. My ex-wife, man, she held me while I cried in frustration. She put over my Bruce Banner, Incredible Hulk, just snaps of rage for the smallest things. She watched me stumble all over the house in a drunken rage, man, until I finally poured myself into bed and passed out. And not because she said anything to bother me, said anything to offend me, because alcohol, in my mind, would help me sleep. It would help me not have to deal with the snap, crackle, and pop of everything that happened in the house. However, too much alcohol loosens prison memories, and I end up yelling at recollections of the past. So why am I sharing this with all of you guys? Our criminal justice system just doesn't work. Convicted criminals are denied education that can help them gain a career when they're released. There's no therapy in prison. There's no rehabilitation. You're lucky if you get an NA meeting or an AA meeting. And only those can be done by outside volunteers who are willing to come in, or staff if they're not too busy to hold a meeting. You know, prison is a world where literally only the strong survive. If you're not watching your back, it could cost you your life. Prison is a war zone with no survivors, not even corrections officers. Corrections officers suffer a secondary trauma known as corrections fatigue. And every year, approximately 156 corrections officers end their lives because of the job. I want y'all to think about this for a minute as I'm closing up. How does it make sense to take a 15-year-old emotionally unstable child and throw him into an emotionally unstable war zone with grown men for 20 years, where the trauma is even worse, where life and death are an everyday reality that has to be focused on at all times in order to survive? And then you just expect them to enter a society that sees them nothing more than a pseudo-citizen. And y'all expect everything to be okay. Does that even make sense? I want to end this with a disclaimer, people. I'm not saying that I'm not guilty of what I was charged with. I'm not saying that I didn't need to be corrected. I'm not saying that I didn't need to be rehabilitated or punished. What I'm saying is, as a society, what was decided upon, unfortunately, is a gift that keeps on giving. The things that I have to go through for the rest of my life because of what I've been through and having to deal with a society that sees me as a plague, as a monster. So I have to deal with it. Thank you guys for your time. Judge Pyle, thank you.
Yeah. Manny, thanks for sharing those very personal reflections. I think it's really a valuable addition to what we're talking about. I think I remember years ago talking to you about, you've obviously been a very constructive participant in society since your release. That I remember you telling me that you had a conversation with one of your cellies once that kind of turned things around for you, and that kind of stuck with me. Can you share anything about that?
Sure. Can I see the timer? All right. Yeah, what had me going, or actually I could say my aha moment in prison was a conversation with one of my cellmates. He asked me about my crime. He asked me, what happened, and I started telling him, trying to justify myself however I could. I was telling him how angry I was, and that when I went out, I was just looking for a fight. I told him that I had got drunk and high that night, and being angry and drunk and high was just a combination of things that helped me do what I needed to do, helped me do what caused me to end up with a life sentence. And in that conversation, he just kept saying, a lot of people do stupid stuff when they're angry, but you still did it, right? He said, a lot of people do stupid stuff when they're drunk or high, but you still did it, right? And he kept saying that. And finally, it just clicked, and I realized I couldn't blame drugs or alcohol. I couldn't blame family. I couldn't blame anger. I made all those decisions. And those things are what ended me where I was at. And I felt like I deserved to be there. But I knew that I needed to change. I knew that I don't want to end up that way. I didn't want to stay that way. And that's actually my aha moment that opened the doors for me to start to change.
Yeah, my friend who runs the Second Chance Center up in Denver, Hassan Latif, wrote a book, 7 Steps to Staying Out of Prison. And step 1 for him is own your own crap. And I think that's clearly what your cellie was telling you. But I think it also goes to the importance of mentors. When I have a slide in my presentations that says the aha moment, and below it, it says, not likely to come from a judge or a probation officer. With all due respect to drug courts, which are very valuable, people need to identify with the people who've kind of walked the path they've walked, I think. Would you agree? Well, let's move on to, and thank you again, Manny, for your remarks. Are really wonderful. Our next speaker is Joel Feynman. Joel, in addition to managing a top-notch law office full of great trial lawyers, has been very involved in advocating for criminal justice reform and also for increasing community awareness of the issues. Like I used to run into Manny, I keep running into Joel from time to time too at events like this. I think Joel's going to give us a little update on some of the legislative initiatives and some of the other issues with criminal justice reforms. So Joel, take it away.
Thank you, Judge Pyle, and thank you to the League of Women Voters for having me, and thank you to you all for attending this morning. I have a PowerPoint. I'm going to try to not recite that PowerPoint verbatim and engage more in conversation, because I think that's obviously a much more interesting way. So I just, like any good Jewish boy who was bar mitzvahed at a temple, I want to start with the quote from the New Testament. For there is nothing hidden that will not be revealed, and nothing concealed that will not be known and brought out into the open. And I think that that is a good cautionary tale for what is going on with mass incarceration, which is eventually, I think, the crimes of mass incarceration, which are all public record, which unfortunately millions upon millions of people can testify to personally, like Mandy did, will eventually be revealed. And as a society, I think eventually we're going to have a pretty extreme day of reckoning where we have to come to terms with just what an inhuman system we have built over the past 50, 60, 100 years. Trying to shift slides here. So a quote that Judge Pyle sorry, this is not shifting. There we go. So Judge Pyle, I think, had a great quote about 60 minutes ago. If substance abuse is a disease, is it moral to incarcerate people for a relapse? And I would actually extend that question to sort of challenge all of you listening to this and all of you who are caring about these issues. If substance abuse is a disease, is it moral to arrest, prosecute, incarcerate people for using substances in the first place? If schizophrenia, if schizoaffective disorder, if bipolar disorder, if post-traumatic stress disorder, if all of these things are also diseases, then is it moral to arrest, prosecute, and incarcerate people who commit criminal acts under the influence of these diseases? And if the answer is no, if we do truly believe that these things are diseases, and we are truly concerned about the morality of arresting and putting people in prison, sometimes for 20 years, sometimes for life, because of these diseases, then we really have to question the very underpinnings of our entire criminal justice system. You know, make no mistake about it, what we have constructed both in this country and in this state is a mass incarceration system of historically breathtaking proportions. If every state were considered a country and looked at based on per capita population, Arizona would be in the top 10 incarceration states in the world, not just the country. The United States of America puts more people behind bars, both as a percentage of its population and as a flat total in terms of number of people, than any other nation on earth. The next closest is El Salvador, and after that, Turkmenistan. So I think we're really faced with two options. Either the United States of America has more evil criminals than any other nation has ever had in the history of the world, or we have too many people in prison. I don't see a third option. I opt for the second choice, which is that we have far, far too many people in prison. And it's important to recognize that mass incarceration has a pronounced racial disparity, always has, always will. It does not fall equally on Black people as it does on white people, on Hispanic people as it does on white people, on Native American people as it does on Asian people. The color of your skin when you are born, a genetic factor which you obviously have no control over, is a strong determinant of whether or not you're going to prison before anything else, before who your mother is, who your father is, who your friends are, whether you end up developing a substance abuse problem later in life. The color of your skin strongly determines whether you go to prison. Such a system cannot be labeled a just, humane, and let alone constitutional system. Let's make no mistake about what kind of system we have constructed in Arizona. In Arizona, we have constructed a system that disproportionately punishes people who have substance abuse problems. We incarcerate more people for drugs than for anything else. November 2021, according to the Arizona Department of Corrections, we have about a little more than 17% of the people in prison are there for drug offenses. 17% are there for drug offenses, 0.8 are there for child and adult abuse. 4.4 are there for child molestation, 0.3% are there for domestic violence. That shows you where our priorities are. Our priorities are not protecting neighborhoods, protecting families, protecting children. If they were, these percentages would be reversed. Our priorities are arresting, prosecuting, and imprisoning people who have substance abuse disorders. That's where we spend all of our money. That's where we spend the vast majority of our criminal justice resources. So I think it's a little bit unfair, actually, for me to claim that this is a criminal justice system. This is a narcotic suppression system. What we've constructed in this country and in this state is a system for suppressing the use of certain substances. Not all substances, right? I can go have a whiskey tonight. I can go have 5 whiskeys. I can drink knowing that alcoholism and deaths associated with alcohol far outnumber, far exacerbate any deaths associated with cocaine or heroin or methamphetamine, just certain substances. And we see this reflected in prosecutions at a very local level. We see that year after year after year, since 2003, with 2 exceptions, 2012 and 2021, but since 2003, Pima County, not just the United States, not just Arizona, but Pima County prosecutes more people for drugs than for any other type of offense. I mean, the idea that in 2020, we prosecuted 2,010 people for drug offenses and 239 people for sex crimes is a tragic commentary on where our criminal justice priorities are. You know, I just wanted to touch on this briefly. I know it's a little bit outside of my mandate from LW, the League of Women Voters and Judge Pyle, but a lot of us, I think, are under a misapprehension that private prisons are a huge problem, and that if we just abolish private prisons, we would take a big bite out of these issues. Private prisons are terrible. They should absolutely be abolished. But keep in mind, in Arizona, you know, only about 20% of all prisoners are in private prisons. Even if we could wave a magic wand and abolish private prisons tomorrow, we would still have a state and a country that incarcerates more people than any other regime since the dawn of time. You know, we see, and we've talked about, Judge Pyle's talked about, and Kate's talked about, Manny sort of alluded to it, what the population of jail and prison look like when we talk about serious mental illness. You know, another thing we don't talk about nearly as much, Manny talked about it a little bit, is how horrifically abusive and violent prisons and jails are. Imagine for a moment that us, me, a privileged white person, sent their son or daughter to a school, and that school, they had a 1 in 8 chance of being sexually assaulted in their public school. If we lived in a society in which our children, my children, had a 1 in 8 chance of being sexually assaulted we would be shutting things down overnight. We would be marching in the streets. We would be burning buildings. We would be overthrowing governments. But because it's happening to them, because it happens to poor people and poor kids and brown kids and Black kids and Native American kids, we allow this horrifically violent, unfair system to continue. And we've allowed it to continue for 30, 40, 50 years. You know, one thing that I think gets short shrift in this conversation is how much parental incarceration is associated with adverse childhood experiences. And I think this is important to sort of push back against the idea that if you do the crime, well, then you should be prepared to do the time. We can have a lot of debates about whether prisons and jails are inhumane, whether people deserve their sentences, whether drugs should be legal or illegal. But one thing we don't talk enough about is when you punish the parent in this system today, you are punishing the child. You are not just punishing the quote unquote criminal, but you are punishing their community, you are punishing their spouse or their partner, and you are actually punishing the next generation. So we have constructed a system that does an incredible job of passing along trauma, the trauma of criminal behavior and the trauma of incarceration throughout the generations. They're doing amazing studies on epigenetic trauma and trauma passed throughout generations. And we see how we are just not only hurting Manny, but hurting Manny's children and Manny's grandchildren by propagating this system of injustice. Something that you all might be particularly interested in is disenfranchisement. The number of disenfranchised people in the United States and in Arizona who have lost the right to vote because of a criminal conviction has skyrocketed over the years. The redder the state, the more disenfranchised voter. You can look at 1980, and then you can look at 2016 to see how much this problem has grown in scope. African-American disenfranchisement because of a criminal conviction has reached obscene proportions. I like cartograms because they show you the size of the problem. If each state were judged by its size, by the total number of disenfranchised voters, Arizona, Florida, the southern states would be the biggest states, some of the biggest states in the country. So what is the state of criminal justice reform in Arizona today? Well, I think one thing that's very, very important to emphasize is that for the last several years, criminal justice reform has been popular across party lines. It is actually one of the most bipartisanly popular legislative agendas. Now, it hasn't been passive, and we can talk about that for a wide variety of reasons. But if you ask voters, regardless of their political party affiliation and who they voted for president, and you separate the issue from the candidate, and you ask them what they think of the issue of criminal justice reform, we see that it's wildly popular and that for all voters, it actually commands majority support. And we see that when we focus in on specific issues, again, a lot of these reform measures command tremendous support in the community, regardless of political affiliation. Support for measures that increase job training, increase rehabilitation, reduce prison time, breaking down barriers for ex-offenders. And then when we talk about drugs, people overwhelmingly support treatment over prison. You can see that this graph was created by an organization called Right on Crime. Right on Crime is actually a very conservative organization that predominantly supports Republican candidates for office. But when it comes to criminal justice reform and mass incarceration, they've spent the last several years in the Arizona State Legislature partnering with organizations like the ACLU and Arizona Attorneys for Criminal Justice to pass criminal justice reform legislation because it's overwhelmingly popular. You know, I'm a little bit afraid of this legislative session because despite the popularity of these measures, when the legislature gets into session, they tend to still want to pass measures that exacerbate mass incarceration. There is a measure right now that is being talked about that's actually being championed by a liberal Democratic lawmaker up in Phoenix to increase, not decrease, but increase mandatory minimum sentences for certain domestic violence abusers. What we have to understand is that if we're opposed to increasing mandatory minimum sentencing, and if we want to dismantle mass incarceration and we want to take meaningful bites out of Arizona and the United States being the prison capital of the planet and of world history, then we have to stop our addiction to sending more people to prison and increasing mandatory minimum sentences, period, full stop. You know, one of the issues that I've spent many, many years trying to advocate for is to get people to understand that criminal justice reform and the construction of the mass incarceration system and the carceral state has really been an issue of the elected prosecutor. And if you want to look more into this, I would suggest Googling John Pfaff, who is the Fordham University law professor who's done groundbreaking research. But basically what he has found is that mass incarceration stems from, since the 1970s and 80s, the elected prosecutor in each jurisdiction filing more and more felony charges. And so if we really want to get serious about ending mass incarceration and implementing criminal justice reform, we can't just talk about police reform, and we can't even just talk about legislative reform, but we have to talk about the politics of the elected prosecutor in each jurisdiction. Finally, what I advocate for and what I hope our legislature advocates for, and what I hope that you folks come away with, is an understanding that what we really need to work on is a public health approach to mass incarceration. Crime is not a police problem. It's not a lawyer problem, and it's not even a judge problem. Crime is almost always a public health problem. When you spend more money on lawyers and public defenders and judges and cops in order to get on top of rising crime rates, all you're doing is trying to bandage up the victims of an accident after the accident has occurred. And we still, as a society, I think, have yet to meaningfully accept this. If we really want to address crime in a humane way and in a systemic way and in a way that actually protects our community, that doesn't mean more cops and more prosecutors and more public defenders. It means, number one, ending prison's exacerbation of crime, like Manny, I think, so eloquently spoke about. Prison is a place you go oftentimes to learn how to be a better criminal and to be traumatized so that you are more likely to commit another crime after you get out. We have to treat existing cases, people who have found themselves in the system. We have to prevent the spread of this public health disease of crime, and we have to inoculate future generations. Preventing the spread and inoculating future generations means that we have to do things that this country, especially in the last 30 years, is more and more hesitant to do. We have to spend more money on schools. We have to spend more money on after-school programs. We have to spend more money on parenting classes, paid parental leave, giving mothers the chance to be on maternity leave with their child so they can breastfeed their child without having to work 50, 60, 70-hour weeks. Paid paternity leave. We need excellent universal health care. These are the policies that will actually stop crime meaningfully for 20, 30, 40, 50, 60 years. It's not more cops and it's not more prisons. And when the alarm bells start going off in your head, just remember that everything I just talked about, more schools, better schools, parenting classes, maternity leave, better healthcare, better psychological treatment for young people, all of that is still cheaper than what we do now. All of that is still cheaper than all of the cops and judges and prosecutors and public defenders and prisons that you are paying for. You are paying the most amount of money in order to solve the problem in the least effective way. And until we adopt a public health approach to the prevention of crime and prevention of violence, not only is that going to continue, but we are going to continue to live in a state, in a country, which is not free, which does not live up to its constitutional ideals, which does not promote freedom for the majority or the plurality of its inhabitants, but is and has become a very, very threatening system of carceral incarceration. Well, a system of incarceration that replicates trauma throughout generations. And until we get serious about that, this problem is just going to keep growing larger and larger and larger. Thank you.
Thank you, Joel. Very good presentation. We're going to do some questions and answers, or come up with some questions. Hopefully you guys come up with some answers. One I was going to lead off with is, I don't know if you're particularly prepared for it, but you have some responses, is what do you say to some angry person in 1 minute? Some angry person who's just convinced that increasing all the punishments is the only way to get to public safety. So what's the short message to respond to that? You want to take that, Kate?
I would love to, because that is actually something we do get all the time, and we talk a lot about. We have all the evidence in the world to be able to address that very specific approach, that if we want to make our community safer, we need to arrest more individuals, we need to have more people in jail, we need to have more people in prison. The reality is that a very limited number of people stay in jail, stay in prison. About 99% of everybody who will go into a prison facility will be released back to the community. And that's certainly very important for somebody who's truly a high risk to the community themselves, a high risk to public safety. But when we're talking about individuals who have substance use dependency, who have extreme amounts of trauma, who have very little habilitative skills, like being able to access employment that has the viability to be able to support oneself, that has a pro-social network. We are social human beings. And if we don't have a social network of other individuals who are able to affirm pro-social activities and not be involved with the justice system, then we are essentially setting every single person up to fail. By increasing access to those other services that both Manny, Joel, and myself have been espousing, we are making our community much safer. If somebody is in jail for a week or two, or in prison for a year or two, these are still members of our community. They're members of our society. They can either come back out into a community where they have employment opportunities and they can be tax-paying citizens, or they can be put back into the same situations they were in before, but now much more criminally sophisticated and overexposed to the justice system. So we are much better. We are not doing ourselves any favor by over-incarcerating, by over-policing, and will only improve our community safety by reaffirming all those other resources.
And Joel, if you can hear me there in San Francisco, do you have your 1 minute pitch to people like that?
I actually think it depends on the person, Judge. If it's a person who is has more of a conservative political orientation, I tend to stress the economics of it. I talk about how what we've constructed is the largest welfare system in the history of this country. If you actually want to shrink welfare, and if you want to spend less money on public works, then you should be a big fan of criminal justice reform. If it's a person who has a more liberal orientation, then I will stress more of the human rights approach and talk about how much harm we're doing to communities and how much harm we're doing to children. So for me, I try and tailor my message to my audience, because I find that different audience members are receptive to very, very different approaches.
All right. So my 10-second pitch would be, are you opposed to cancel culture? Do you believe people are capable of redemption? Chew on that for a while and get back to me. Manny, I was wondering if, there was one other thing you mentioned about your experience years ago when we were talking. I think as you had your aha moment and were planning for release, one of the things you were focused on is not returning to your old neighborhood. Am I right remembering that?
Yes, sir.
And how did that work out?
I returned to my old neighborhood.
And why was that?
I couldn't get a job, and I couldn't get adequate housing. The only way that someone like me can find housing when you first get out is to look for a cardboard sign attached to a stop sign that says house for rent. And those are usually in the neighborhoods that I left. So,
Right. So even with a good plan, there can be some really very, very serious obstacles.
yes, sir.
Kate, I wanted to, if I remember some of the stats right from our MacArthur grant studies, the population most negatively impacted in terms of their representation in the population at the jail was Native Americans, I believe.
Yeah, Native Americans in our jails currently, we have a population rate of about 6 to 7%, and overall in our community, it's about 2%. So significantly overrepresented in our jail locally.
So do we have any strategies for responding to that at this time, or?
Well, as I teased a little bit, we are announcing next week a new program that is going to be in partnership with the MacArthur Foundation, where we will be systemically addressing race disparities in our justice system. We've had lots of programs, we've had certainly lots of community engagement, and we will continue to do all of those strategies. But one of our biggest barriers to understanding disparity is our data. Unfortunately, we can tell you exactly at any moment who is in the jail currently, and that's a snapshot. At this point in time, here are the demographics of the population, but it doesn't really tell the story of somebody who's moving through the justice system. What is the demographics of the overall arresting population? When they're detained initially, who is getting out at initial appearance and who is being released? What is the average length of stay for historically disadvantaged communities as compared to the overall population? We really need to be able to dive into this data and look at multiple intercepts, how these various systems are interacting with one another, like law enforcement to the jail, to the courts. And once we have a much better understanding of where the disparities are actually happening, then we can look at evidence-based practices to intervene at those exact targets.
All right. I think you may remember that I ended my judicial career with 6 months sitting up in Flagstaff. And I was shocked to find the Native American population in Coconino County was about 21%. And the population in the Coconino County Jail was 54% Native American. But I think this, I appreciated Kate Stewart doing the land acknowledgement at the start of our presentation today. I think this is a population that we need to keep front of mind as we deal with these issues for sure.
Judge, can I just add something to Manny's?
Yeah, please do.
So when Manny was talking about why he had to go back to the neighborhood he didn't want to go back to, I don't think we fully appreciate how mass incarceration punishes long after you get out of jail and prison. Explicit discrimination against people who have a criminal record is perfectly legal in every state in the country. You can not hire, and people often do, somebody because of their criminal record specifically. You can not give them a home because of their criminal record. It is perfectly legal to discriminate. So this idea you do the crime, you do the time. Well, the time doesn't end when you walk out of jail or prison. I showed that slide about how epigenetic trauma of incarceration passes through generations. But even the person who supposedly is released because they've been rehabilitated, in many, many ways, they are punished for the rest of their lives. And that's part of the horror of the system that we've constructed.
I saw a question. Didn't explain some of my acronyms. One was the CCJ. One reason I didn't explain it is that what it stood for blanked out of my mind as I was saying it, but it's the Council on Criminal Justice. You can find them online. If you Google Council on Criminal Justice, they have many very data-based studies. And they studied the whole prison population across the country in 2019 on the technical violation issue. And the other one was positive UAs and missed drops. In terms of supervising people on probation and parole, we collect massive amounts of urine. I guess that's a little facetious, but we have people, it's not easy. You have to get off work, you have to get there in time. If you miss it, you're in trouble. So a positive UA is when your urinalysis tests for a drug that you're not supposed to be using, and the missed drops is not getting to the facility to submit your urine sample. And either of those can send you back to prison. Now, probation officers will say that, well, no, this was like the 10th or 15th missed drop. Well, it's still a disease. And you haven't figured out a way to respond to that disease, and neither have they. So, that's kind of what's going on there. I'll just add one last thing. My view on UAs and missed drops is that all our urinalysis should be in connection with treatment, except for an initial screening urinalysis. After that, the only purpose to doing urinalysis would be in connection with treatment. And that would eliminate a lot of heartache for probation officers and distrust between the officer and the person. So I saw, there's another question. This old guy getting there. Yeah, so I think, Joel, this will be you for sure, and Kate, because I know the county gets involved in this, but the question had to do with how's Walt Blackman doing, and do we see any bipartisan hope in the coming session?
He's doing great. I've had 2 meetings with him so far on the data bill that I helped write several sessions ago, addressing what Kate was talking about, which is that part of the problem when we talk about reform is that we just don't have the data. We don't know who's in jail for what, who takes what plea agreements, who gets sentenced for what, and how long those sentences are. And so Representative Blackman, who is very different from me politically in many ways, is becoming a strong proponent of that bill. To the question of what can we do to support this on a bipartisan basis. So I guess I have a 2-point answer. Part 1 is we need to care about criminal justice the same way we cared about Red for Ed. Until we have 60,000 people marching on the Capitol of all political persuasions, of all parties, wearing T-shirts and holding signs who care about criminal justice reform as much as we cared about Red for Ed, it's probably not going to happen. And the next thing we have to do, and I cannot stress this enough, I showed you that graph from John Pfaff, who is the researcher from Fordham. We need to understand that we have to not just talk to our legislators, but we have to talk to our elected prosecutors. We have to talk to Pima County Attorney Laura Conover. We have to talk to Maricopa County Attorney Alistair Adele. We have to talk to Yavapai County Attorney Sheila Polk. We have to talk to Pinal County Attorney, he's going to kill me because this is recorded, Kent Volkmer. These are people whose names we probably don't know. They have tremendous influence in this system. And so people of both parties, all parties, need to get on the phone and send emails to these county attorneys. Now, the nice part about that is they don't get nearly as many phone calls and emails as even state representatives and senators do. They pay a lot of attention to those emails and phone calls. So get to know your county attorney and tell them what you want to see in terms of criminal justice reform. It'll have a huge impact.
Kate, does the county have a plan coming forward?
Certainly, every year the county puts forward its legislative agenda, and I will try and see if I can't Google the Pima County's 2020 legislative agenda, but it really focused on criminal justice in particular and criminal justice reform. At the top of our wish list is bail reform. Somebody posted that link in the chat. I'm really grateful. We will continue to advocate for bail reform because until we can create a jail appearance system that's based off of actual risk to the community as opposed to ability to pay and being impoverished, we're going to have significant inequity and over incarceration in our jail system. Another area that we're really hoping to look at is being able to have a lot more flexibility and creativity on the prosecuting side when it comes to substance use charges. having possession and paraphernalia being felonies is really restricted, not only in terms of the creativity to be able to divert, deflect, and have right-sized punishment depending on what it is that that person has going on. But we really want to be able to have a lot more choice in our community on how we see these people. Currently, if you have a felony and you are arrested, you have to go through the jail booking process. Outside the jail, we have something called the pre-booking modular, and anybody who's arrested for a non-violent misdemeanor, so more or less most things other than DV, they go through that modular, they are screened by pretrial services, and they are released on community supervision before they ever have to walk into the jail. Having that ability to not have to be seen by a judge means that we're able to really screen for public safety and get people back into the community where they belong. When the felonies do not give us that type of flexibility based off of statute. So that's another area that we are really hoping that the state legislator will revisit.
Yeah. Manny, I don't know if we can respond to this, but I was wondering if there were some kind of, in terms of dealing with the stigma and the uncertainties of the transition, were there some positive experiences you had that kind of allowed you to feel more like you fit in? And I'm hoping that maybe if there are those, that'll kind of give us a clue as to what we all can do to be a more welcoming and accepting community to people returning from custody.
That's a big question, Judge. I can't say that there was really any kind of breaks or anything when I first got out. I think in 2014, the Second Chance Tucson was formed. And I remember becoming a part of that and somebody asking me how I felt about all this reentry stuff being created around town and everything. I said, it's bittersweet. I mean, it's sweet because I'm glad you guys are doing it now, but it's bitter because it didn't exist when I got out. Quickly, I want to just mention something that Joel was talking about earlier about the discrimination. We don't want to admit it, but we live in a caste system here in America. If you're formerly incarcerated, you're on the lower rung of that. One of the things that I like to tell people all the time is it's not me that proves that prison doesn't work. It's not me recidivizing that proves that prison doesn't work. If prison did the job that it was supposed to do, if it had rehabilitated me, had it corrected me, then society would welcome me back with open arms. But the fact that society is afraid of me is proof that prison doesn't work.
Right. And I would say that statistic I cited before, that of the 78% of the prisoners have a substance use problem, and of the close to 34,000 in there, 795 were in addiction treatment. So we're not even trying. Basically, we know what the problem is, and we don't even try. So the rehabilitation needs to be amped up, clearly behind the walls before people are released and once they get outside. And there needs to be kind of a smooth transition for that. You're absolutely right about that. Joel, the private prisons may only have 20% of the prisoners, but there's a new contract. The state is thankfully going to close the Florence Central Unit, as I understand it, which is only overdue by about 50 years, and is awarded a $450 million contract to Core Civic to build a private prison in Eloy. What are your thoughts about that?
It's horrible, and I don't know any of my friends who aren't in favor of abolishing private prisons. Private prisons are slavery. They're a violation, I think, of the 13th Amendment. What you are doing is you are profiting off the selling of human beings. There is more than enough evidence from every jurisdiction that has private prisons that private prisons lobby for tougher criminal justice bills, for more mandatory minimum sentencing in order to fill beds. They want to buy human beings from the state in order to fill beds to make money. It is modern day slavery, and it's an abomination. I also think that our focus on private prisons tends to exculpate our own culpability in contributing to the larger 80% of the problem, which is not understanding that just because a politician, a public official, vocalizes their opposition to private prisons means they're good on criminal justice reform and ending mass incarceration. Opposing private prisons is the first step, not the last step. And so I think we need to be very cognizant of making that the first question we ask people, the end of the discussion, not the end of our analysis, when we're trying to figure out who do we want leading us that is actually going to do something meaningful about criminal justice reform.
I can tell you, Joel, that I feel like it's really a lost opportunity. That one of the things that virtually all of us in the United States need to be thinking about is designing prisons architecturally in a much more humane way. And that's not going to happen in this $460 million contract. But I think that we send people over to Europe, to Australia, to Canada to visit their prisons, and we come back saying, well, this is really great, but we can't do that here. And it's just, it's just this notion, well, how would we be able to do that? It just defies logic that we can't see a more humane picture on what we're doing. So it's money that could be used in a much more humane way.
I agree. My fear, Judge, though, and this is where I might be a little more radical than a lot of other people, I fear that making prisons better sort of papers over what my belief is, which is that we shouldn't have prisons at all. It's sort of like the idea that you can have more humane forms of execution. Maybe lethal injection is more humane than death by hanging, but advocating for lethal injection sort of concedes the playing field for me, which is that our entire system is fundamentally flawed. It's the existence of prisons that I really have an issue with, not just how they're constructed.
Right. That's a good point. But I do think that our current architectural model, really just the architecture of the prisons, amplifies the trauma of everybody who's working there.
I agree with that 100%.
Yeah. Let's see if I can see another question here. I better get on the ball here. Yeah, one is, I imagine private prisons has a powerful lobbyist in Arizona. I think that's pretty safe to assume. Let's see if I can, in the chat, I think there was, one other is, yeah, there's several questions about what are we going to do about racial disparities. And I think that's going to be a tough one to answer in 4 minutes, but that's just an overall societal problem. But there are definitely some things that we can start doing and obviously that's the key point of what you're working on, Kate. So you want to take that on a little bit?
Sure. So as I mentioned, we have a number of different strategies addressing racial and ethnic disparity. Certainly a big part of that is community engagement. And we have a community collaborative that if anybody's interested in participating, please feel free to send us an email at justiceservices@pima.gov. Community engagement is one portion. I think historically government has had the attitude to say, oh, we're here from the government, we're here to save you. We really need to stop and assess every strategy that we're doing and run it past the impacted communities. It's not just about individuals with lived experience in the justice system. It's about family members, employers, community members, neighborhood associations, having conversations and really understanding both positive and unintended consequences to any of the choices that we make really has to be, we have to take our time and do it right. Another really important component is partnering with non-governmental entities. This new project that we're going to be announcing next week, we've partnered with the YWCA of Southern Arizona, who has been an extraordinary partner, and they have built trust with a lot of the communities already that we're seeking to engage with. We don't have to be the sole path forward to creating any kind of meaningful systemic change. We can work with community organizations that already have a lot of that institutional and lived experience knowledge. And trust is so important when you make any of these changes, that working with organizations that have the trust of the communities is absolutely critical.
I think, Judge, there's also something to be said for recognizing that the racial disparities we see in the system is a feature, not a bug. That the system very much was constructed along racially disparate lines. People should look a little bit into, you might remember John Ehrlichman, one of Nixon's aides. And in 1968, during his reelection campaign, Ehrlichman is reported to have said, quote, "We knew we couldn't make it illegal to be either against the Vietnam War or illegal to be Black. But by getting the public to associate the hippies with marijuana and Blacks with heroin, and then criminalizing both heavily, we could disrupt both of those communities." So Dr. Michelle Alexander has done the groundbreaking work on this, but I think there is a long history and a lot of scholarship demonstrating, like I said, that racial disparities are very much an intentional feature of the system, not just an unfortunate byproduct.
So Manny, in 30 seconds, can you wrap up that question or that topic, or whatever thoughts you want to share here in 30 seconds?
I think Joe Feynman hit it on the head with that quote. I mean, I think that's perfect. Racial and ethnic disparities fill the prisons, and it's just, yeah, it's a rough place to be.
All right. I want to thank Joel and Manny and Kate for their presentations and the outstanding information they've provided. And I want to thank again the League of Women Voters for the opportunity we had to present this information today.
Good morning. My name is Nancy Hand, and I'm the president-elect of the League of Arizona, League of Women Voters of Greater Tucson. I would like to thank all of our panelists for their excellent presentations and for their really broad overview of what is wrong with the criminal justice system, particularly in Arizona. And I would also like to thank all of the attendees. And I would like to answer for you the question that I am sure is on your minds, which is, what can we do? We at the League of Arizona, League of Women Voters of Arizona, for the first time last year, have approved a position on criminal justice due to these concerns among our members. And so now we are able to advocate in the area of criminal justice for the first time. So we are new to this table, but we are very anxious and excited to roll up our sleeves and get to work. And we do have some upcoming opportunities to become active for our members. The first one that I'd like to share with you is the state level legislative advocacy committee. We have a meeting coming up on January 19th. That's for those of you League of Women Voters members who would like to help us follow legislation during this legislative session and advocate and encourage our members to advocate on the bills that we see coming. Those include the cash bail bill, elimination of cash bail, as well as defelonization of drug crimes, drug possession, and also elimination of fees in juvenile court that saddles families with huge amounts of debt. I'll put the registration link in the chat for that. And also, we have a specific educational event coming up on cash bail, elimination of cash bail. That's next Saturday, the 22nd, January 22nd at 10 a.m. We are honored to be collaborating with Tucson NAACP and honored to have the participation of Dr. Shereen Meeks, who will be presenting this initiative in detail at 10 a.m. next Saturday. That will be a very short presentation, 45 minutes. So please join us for those events. Here is the link for the legislative advocacy team. That is for league members. If you are not a league member, I urge you to join us. I hope it's not necessary to say that the League of Women Voters of Arizona is open to all. We have many men members, very active members, and here is the link for next Sunday's educational event. Again, I would like to thank all of our panelists. A special thank you to you, Manny, for showing us with the beauty of your words that you are not other, you are us, we are you. We do not see you as a plague or a danger. And we are, as the League of Women Voters of Arizona, are committed to working to achieve criminal justice reform in Arizona together with all of you. Thank you very much.